Never heard that before. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to History Author Talks, and I am very excited about tonight's show. Tonight we have actually 4 authors with us tonight. 2 of our authors are going to be telling you about their new books. So I am Roger Williams. I am the owner of Roger Williams Agency and the producer of this show, History Author Talks. I am also the co-founder of an organization called 10crucialdays.org. 10crucialdays.org is an umbrella 501c3 that promotes the events of Washington Crossing and the battles of Trenton, Assunpink, and the Battle of Princeton. So this particular book that our author Patrick O'Donnell is going to be presenting tonight has particular interest of me, to me, and fortunately all of you, I'm sure, too. I also wanted to give a special shout out and welcome to my fellow members of the Sons of the American Revolution. I am the Princeton chapter president of the Sons of the American Revolution. So my fellow members, my compatriots from the Princeton chapter are joining us tonight. And we are also really thrilled to be joined by our brothers across the river at the Washington Crossing chapter of the Sons of the American Revolution. It just seems so appropriate for tonight's show. So I'm very pleased that they are joining us as well. You've noticed the artwork behind me, the crossing. I am the executive producer of a musical called The Crossing in the 10 Crucial Days. On June 19th, we are having a special showing of some of the music from the Crossing musical at the Thomas Paine Cottage in New Rochelle, New York. So you can check my website, or rather my Facebook page, or just go to the Facebook page for the Crossing musical, and you'll learn more about that. That's very exciting. As we have our show, as we go through our show, if you have questions for the authors, I invite you to use the chat feature, which is at the bottom of your frame in Zoom. Those questions will come to me, and I will then forward those questions to our guest host, who we will introduce in just a minute. So please do send your questions to me, and I will be happy to forward those along. I will be, as the authors are going to be talking, I am going to include links to their websites. I'm also going to be including links to bookshop.org. I've set up a bookshop with the books from all of our authors tonight. So our guest host, our partner in history, and our 2 authors. This bookshop link has the books for all of our authors tonight. So, and the proceeds benefit the Sons of the American Revolution Genealogical Research Library. So I invite you to get the books for our authors tonight through that link. So with that, I'd like now to introduce our partner in history. Our partner in history is the Washington Crossing Historic Park in Pennsylvania. Speaking for Washington Crossing Historic Park is David Price, who is a historical interpreter and is the author of a trilogy about the 10 crucial days of the American Revolution: John Hazlitt's World, The Road to Assunpink Creek, and Rescuing the Revolution. Full disclosure, I am the publisher of David's books. And you can find more information about David's books and his Revolutionary War blog, which is terrific, by the way, on called Speaking of Which, on his website, which I will put in the chat feature, that is just dpauthor.com. That's David Price, author, dpauthor.com. So with that, I'm very pleased to turn the screen over to David Price. David, it's all yours.
Thank you, Roger. Let me see if I can bring my slides up here.
I have to share I have to allow you to share screen. Let's see. Let me make sure that I do that. Okay. Just let it kick in for a minute here and it will, you should be able to share screen in a moment. While we're waiting for David's screen, I just got a message that we also have a member of the New Mexico Society of the Sons of the American Revolution. So I welcome that compatriot from New Mexico as well. Terrific.
Should I try it now?
Yep, go ahead. Any luck?
It's not appearing in the box. I see the slides on the left-hand side of my screen, but
All right.
let's see.
Let me see if we can. Okay. Oh, there we go.
There we go.
Okay, go for it.
You can see them?
No, I see a
Oh, wait a minute.
blank
Okay,
screen.
now I see them. All right. Let's see.
Seeing only a white screen.
Yeah, we only see the white screen.
Not now.
Nope, not yet.
It says you are screen sharing.
Right, but it doesn't look, you may not be sharing the correct screen. Let me try something here. All right, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen, David. I've got the screen, I've got the slides. So I'm going to stop yours and start mine. And let's.
A real river coming
And
down
I
out
will
there.
share my screen. Thank you for your patience, everybody. There we go.
Gee, I'm glad this is easy.
Okay, so let's roll. Can you
Okay.
see? Okay.
All right. So thank you, Roger, for this opportunity to promote the park. And I think it's probably fair to say there's no more hallowed ground in North America than this venue on the banks of the Delaware. Pennsylvania Park, of course, is the sister park of, but an entirely separate entity from New Jersey's Washington Crossing State Park. The PA Park is the site of where Washington's army embarked on its legendary Christmas night 1776 crossing to attack the Hessian Brigade in Trenton. And by doing so begin the remarkable 10 Crucial Days winter campaign that profoundly altered the course of the Revolutionary War. And let's see. Oh, okay. So the tour program is back in operation at the park. Tours are offered daily, 6 times a day. At the bottom of the hour, the gentleman whose image you see there is Thomas Maddock II, who turns 85 in October, has been giving tours at the park for more than a decade. He actually spent the first 15 years of his life living at the park and moved away, and then in retirement came back home, so to speak. Okay, if you haven't been to the park, if you've been to the park, but not recently, that is not within the last, say, 2 or 3 years, you may want to come back if for no other reason than to see the new exhibit area in the visitor center in the lower park. It's been completely redone, and I would say for the better. The boat barn at the park, in the lower park section, where the crossing actually occurred in 1776, was built at the time of the bicentennial and houses the replica Durham boats that are used in the 2 reenactments of the crossing in December. The Christmas Day crossing has been going on every year, more or less, since 1953. The replica boats were built at different times. The oldest boat dates from the 1960s, no longer floats. Oh, we lost the screen. No longer floats, and so they tend not to use that one for the reenactment of the crossing. The Makaki's Ferry Inn in the lower park section, which is the site of the only building, its predecessor wooden building that was there in 1776. It is currently closed for renovations that are being done by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania to about a dozen buildings in the park, which will be going on for the next 1.5 years. The historic buildings that visitors see in the lower park section are the remnants of the village of Taylorsville from the early 1800s. These are original houses. They are not repros, but they were not on this site at the time of Washington's crossing. I don't know why the slides are jumping around like this on me. The house you see in the picture is the Mail and Taylor House, which I believe is the oldest of those remnant buildings, was built in 1817. So that would have been about 41 years after Washington was there. In the upper park, about 4 miles above the visitor center, is the Thompson-Neely House, 2/3 of which date from prior to the Revolution. TN is you might say, the center of historical focus in the upper park. And although the house is closed as part of that renovation that I mentioned, the mill and the grounds of the house will be open for guided tours on a daily basis, twice a day. Bowman's Hill Tower, also in the upper park, is probably the most heavily trafficked area of the park. It gives you a fantastic view on a clear day. Tallest point in Bucks County. Tower itself really has no historic significance as such because it wasn't built till 1930, but we believe the hill that it is on was used as an observation post by the Continental Army during the winter of 1776-77. The limestone statue that's across the street from the park, a very short stone's throw from the lower park section, sits on the grounds of the Washington Crossing Inn. The reason it is there on private property and not in the park proper is because the people of Bedford, Indiana, who donated it at the time of the bicentennial, insisted that this was to be their gift to the nation and not to be the property of any single state. If it were across the street, it would be the property of Pennsylvania. So that's why it's located where it is. And my last slide bears an image that I think may be the one that people most commonly or popularly associate with the park. This monument, which is right outside the visitor center in the lower park section, was the first permanent formal memorial to the crossing, dates from 1895, and the inscription on it says that Washington crossed near this spot. Unfortunately, it doesn't tell you that this monument has been moved a couple of times over the years, but generically, I guess that inscription is still accurate. So that does it for me. And again, I'd like to thank Roger for giving me this opportunity to promote the park and encourage people to visit.
Wonderful. Thank you, David. I appreciate it. Technical issues notwithstanding. I am now very pleased to introduce our guest host for this evening, Norman Desmarais. Norm is Professor Emeritus at Providence College and is an active reenactor in Les Régiments Bonvoyeurs. I'm butchered that. You're going to have to correct that for me. The 2nd Rhode Island Regiment and the Brigade of the American Revolution. He's the editor-in-chief of the Brigade Dispatch, the journal of the Brigade of the American Revolution, and the author of Battlegrounds of Freedom, the 6-volume Guide to the American Revolutionary War, the Guide to the American Revolutionary War at Sea and Overseas, 7 volumes, which covers more than 10,500 actions. Norm has also authored America's First Ally, France in the Revolutionary War, and Washington's Engineer, Louis de Portail. My French is terrible tonight, sorry about that. And the creation of an Army Corps. His most recent book, The Road to Yorktown, The French Campaign in the American Revolution, 1780 to 1783, The Diary of the Count Labordier, General Rochambeau's nephew and aide-de-camp. So with that, I will turn it over to Norm to introduce our guests this evening. Norm, over to you.
Thank you very much, Roger. Tonight we have 2 distinguished speakers, the first of which is Patrick K. O'Donnell, who is a best-selling, critically acclaimed military historian and an expert on elite units. He is the author of 12 books, including The Unknowns and Washington's Immortals, and a fellow at Mount Vernon. He is the recipient of numerous national awards, and he served as a combat historian in a Marine rifle platoon during the Battle of Fallujah. He is a professional speaker on America's conflicts, espionage, special operations, and counterinsurgency. He has provided historical consulting for DreamWorks' award-winning miniseries, The Band of Brothers, and for documentaries produced by the BBC, the History Channel, and Discovery. Tonight he will be speaking to us about his latest book, Indispensable, the diverse soldier mariners who shaped the country, formed the Navy, and rode Washington across the Delaware. The Wall Street Journal and the Associated Press published rave reviews of the book, and it was already in its 3rd reprinting on the publication date, which was only 2 weeks away, and 2 weeks ago, and the book is already out of stock. So with that, I introduce to you Patrick K. O'Donnell.
Norm, thank you very much for the introduction. And Roger, thank you for hosting this, and thank you for your friendship. You know, I mean, if anybody wants to get an agent or a book published, talk to Roger. I've been doing this for 22 years, and Roger is one of the best in the business. He technically understands the business. He understands sales. He has a technical knowledge that's really unsurpassed from many agents, or in his case, publisher as well. So he's really an extraordinary talent and somebody that I would recommend wholeheartedly. I also want to thank all the other hosts on tonight, and David as well. Love Washington Crossing Park. It's one of my favorite places to be. Just there on Memorial Day, as a matter of fact. And we happened to meet you, which was great. It was a pleasure. You know, The Indispensables is my 12th book, and I have a process to some degree on how I choose a book. And I go through a number of steps. One, is the story been done before or is relatively unknown? Is a story something that is a small story that can tell a larger story? And that's certainly the case with The Indispensables. That's a story that talks about specific individuals in Marblehead, their regiment, leading figures, and then tells their story, but also tells a portion of the American Revolution in the early days. Another aspect that I also look at is whether or not it's even doable. Is the research there? I've had a couple books, well, actually one, when I first started out I was about 3 years into writing, or 4, and I literally ran into a brick wall with the research. It was just too hard. Most of it was classified by MI6, and it was difficult. I now know that I could do that book if I wanted to go back to it. But that's another criteria. I also like to tell a story that can be adapted to film, TV, etc. I've got an amazing talent agency that's behind this book. They love it. But really, another aspect is the journey itself. I love the research. I love to spend time with the story. I've got to be interested in it. That's an important element of it. But really, the last thing maybe is the most important thing. I ask myself one single question: who cares? Why does it matter? You don't have to really ask that much of a question with the Indispensables. Literally, we would not be here had it not been for the efforts of these men, and in some cases women, from Marblehead, Massachusetts. This is a town that's located about 16 miles as a crow flies from Boston, north of Boston. And during the American Revolution, it was a bustling port town, the second largest port town in Massachusetts. And it was the engine for the Massachusetts economy. Much of that engine came from cod fishing. And the men would fish the Grand Banks, which is well over 1,000 miles away from Marblehead, up in Nova Scotia, where they would brave the most hazardous and dangerous waters of the world at the time, where life and death decisions would have to be made within seconds. And you had to rely on the person next to you. And that's kind of where we start with the Indispensables. This book begins with a boat, a story that's coming back from the Grand Banks. It's known as the Pit Packet, and it's coming back from a voyage. Marblehead was a great trading outpost. They would fish, but then they would sell that fish and other goods all around the world. Very cosmopolitan place. But as the Pit Packet was returning to Marblehead, it was intercepted by a British boat, the Rose in particular, a warship. And it wasn't a friendly encounter. They boarded the Pit Packet to seize the sailors on board that ship to impress them. And it was here that the Marbleheaders had an act of defiance. They refused to leave the ship because they knew that their lives would be enslaved effectively in the Royal Navy. It wasn't a choice. They were coming with the British officer, if they liked it or not. It didn't matter if they had families or a fortune. They would be basically enslaved by the British Navy, paid a pittance, and it was a life service. Most of the men that were impressed never came home, and most died on aboard Royal Navy vessels. These men decided to fight back. And it's a very dramatic scene, the opening scene of this book. A bag of salt spills across the deck as the British board. There's a bit of a scuffle. And Michael Corbett, who's a character in my book, says if you cross the line of sand that he drew with his foot, you're a dead man. The British officer refused to listen and stepped forward rather confidently, thinking that there would be no retribution. But Michael Corbett hurled a harpoon directly at his carotid artery, killing him practically instantly. But that's the opening scene of the Indispensables. It's about defiance. It's about people that were constantly being interfered with by the royal government. And it was a situation of interference in their daily lives through impressment. It was through taxation, or it was through excessive regulation from 3,000 miles away, a bureaucracy that they didn't even know. And things would escalate. And the Marbleheaders would be involved in some of the major actions in the pre-Revolutionary War era. The revolution itself. They were tied into the Stamp Act and the protests there, but also impressment really ignited things, as well as the Boston Massacre, where leading several of the main characters in my book, Dr. Benjamin Church, for instance, who's a main character in this book, has very intimate ties with Marblehead through mistresses that he has, as well as deep friendships. This is a book about friendships between several leading and key doctors, Dr. Joseph Warren, Dr. Benjamin Church, and their close friend, Dr. Nathaniel Bond, I'll get to later. But things escalate and continue to an atrocity, the Boston Massacre, and then the Boston Tea Party. The Marbleheaders are many key members of the Tea Party itself. They're sons of the American Revolution. One of the main characters in this book is Elbridge Gary, and his views of liberty and freedom will sound through the American Revolution and then be a very important aspect of the Constitution later on. Gary has a view of republicanism with a small r, and he takes that abstract thought and concept and makes it reality. These men are at the very forefront of the American Revolution, the political revolution that is simmering. And, you know, as the Tea Party kicks off, I mean, there's a number of intolerable acts that you're familiar with. It hits the Marbleheaders extremely hard. There's something called the Fisheries Act that takes place later in 1775 that will be enacted, but they get wind of it. And their livelihood is completely destroyed. They're not able to fish the Grand Banks. And they also see other things that are happening. The political revolution changes after the Somerville powder alarm, where General Gage knows that the colonies are in full revolt, and he plans to deal with it. And the Achilles heel throughout the American Revolution, or the early stages of the American Revolution, is powder. There is no organic supply of powder in the colonies. Most of it had been either regulated away or it had been outsourced to India, where there was cheaper supplies of it. So powder production didn't exist. And then a series of regulations ban it. And this is where the Marbleheaders play an incredibly important role. The important role is that General Gage knows that powder is the Achilles heel and will do everything possible to disarm us by taking away the powder. We had guns, but we didn't have powder, and he knew it. In all of the early raids, all the early operations relate directly to powder. The powder alarms, all of them are in many ways directly related to the Marbleheaders, or they have elements of the men that I talk about in this book are involved in them. And Fort William and Mary, for instance, opening shots, Marbleheaders are involved in the intelligence that's involved in there. Some Marbleheaders in the operation itself. And things just continue to spin forward to Lexington and Concord. Well, first Salem, where there's a Salem powder alarm, where literally the entire Revolutionary War could have been ignited at Salem. And I get into the really rather whimsical powder alarm where Colonel Leslie lands over 200 troops in Marblehead. They march overland to Salem to a drawbridge, and thousands gather, including the entire Marblehead Regiment, as well as the Salem Regiment, other regiments. The place is filled with Americans, and shots are nearly fired. There's a bayonet that's impaled in one individual. It pricks him a little bit. And, you know, things are settled peacefully by, in a rather whimsical way. Leslie demands to go over the bridge. And the men of Marblehead and the Salemites say, you can go over the bridge, but you can't go more than 50 yards because, you know, several hundred yards further away are cannon and other gunpowder supplies. They let him go across the bridge 50 yards, and then they say you can go back across the bridge to your boats. And Leslie does exactly that and is humiliated. And then it's not until Lexington and Concord where the American Revolution begins, and it's all about the Marbleheaders again. The bulk of those supplies, the bulk of the cannon, and nearly all the powder was gathered by the Marbleheaders. And here's where it's important. Their trading relationships were converted into supply lines, and they brought that powder, they smuggled it in. And our first foreign aid came from Spain, and it came from the trading relationships that Marblehead established, that they had established over decades of time. And they had literally scores of ships that were bringing in gunpowder and bringing in guns, and the record of this is quite is compelling. It's in 1774, before the first shots of the American Revolution, and there's also a complete record of the powder that was stored at Lexington at Concord. and it just continues to move forward. And it's the Marbleheaders that are at the forefront of much of the battle as the British are retreating back to Boston. They intercept the British portions of the regiment. Many of the men are still at sea fishing, but then there is a large portion that aren't, and they are fighting at what's now known as Arlington. And some of the key figures of the regiment, such as John Glover, are there. And they continue to battle and fight. And what's also very compelling is that the revolutionaries may not have understood information warfare, or I should say they may not have coined the term information warfare, but they sure as hell knew what the narrative was. And the narrative was driven by the Marbleheaders. It's Elbridge Gary that it goes out with another team of men. They sit on the Council of Safety and Supplies for the Massachusetts provincial government, and they're tasked with organizing and gathering the depositions from Lexington and Concord. And they construct the American narrative, which is vitally important on the all-important point of who fired first. And from their perspective, it was the Americans that were the victims. And they make that point very clear as they depose the main American participants as well as British participants. And they find the fastest ship that's out there. And they beat General Gage's ship by 2.5 weeks, even though General Gage's ship left earlier. I think this is one of the greatest forgotten and unknown voyages in American history because it changes everything. It's a tidal wave of information that changes the empire overnight. It's now the American story of victimhood and the American narrative that dominates, and they dominates for nearly 2 weeks in the British papers. And it's, going forward again, it's the Marbleheaders that play a key role at Bunker Hill. They also play an important role when Washington arrives in Cambridge. It's the Marbleheaders that guard Washington. They guard him. They form a very special relationship at Cambridge, at the Vassal House in particular. Washington trusts the Marbleheaders, and it's an incredibly important relationship that would spawn later on something called the Life Guard, or the Commander-in-Chief's Guard. This is his hand-picked unit of men that was led by a Marbleheader, Caleb Gibbs. But when the Commander-in-Chief got to Boston, he realized that his power supply was critical. Men had 8-9 cartridges per man. They were down to nothing. They couldn't even withstand several probing attacks, or major attacks by the British had they launched their way out of Boston. Powder was crucial. It remains the crucial element for the first 2 years of the war. And Washington comes up with some very innovative ways to get powder. There's a thought of going to Halifax because of to raid the powder magazines. Problem is they don't have a ship to get there. That's where the relationship with John Glover and the Marblehead men come into play. And it's here that Washington decides that perhaps maybe there's a way to get to Halifax with a Glover ship. That idea is scotched. And then there's a plan to crew a ship by the Army. It's very important that these men were not privates, if you will, or private citizens. They were members of the Continental Army, and they were manning and crewing a ship. And that ship was the Hannah, and it was outfitted with 4 guns. And the goal of the Hannah was to try to pick off the various British transports that were sailing and reinforcing Boston. And there were many ships that were laden with powder and other supplies. And Washington knew that, and secretly, without notifying Congress, didn't have the authority to do that. He didn't have the authority to create a navy, but that's exactly what he does. authorizes one ship and then another and then another. And it's the Marblehead Regiment that staffs or crews those ships, and later they bring in other captains. But they were all members of the Continental Army that are in these early years. I make that point. Are manning what is known as Washington's cruisers or Washington's Navy, and they go after various British ships. That's just part of the story. It's a very detailed and interesting. They seize several major prizes. Some of the greatest prizes of the war are powder ships that are seized by Marbleheaders, such as Captain Mugford's ship. But later on, as the war progresses, it's the Marbleheaders that become indispensable. And one of the great cases of their indispensable nature is the American Dunkirk, which occurs on August 29th, August 30th, that night, when after the Battle of Long Island, Battle of Brooklyn, where the Washington's Immortals, book I also wrote, make an epic stand a couple days earlier that buys the time, the Army an hour more precious in its history than any other in our country. They retreat back to the fortifications at Brooklyn Heights, and it's here that Washington decides to instead to retreat, and it's on the backs of the Marbleheaders that he relies everything. The entire army, the entire country is on the backs of the Marbleheaders, as they have to bring the 9,500 men and all their equipment on a mission impossible. The East River was fast flowing, it was swirling, there was currents. It wasn't working that night at all, and they were going nowhere. They tried to call off the operation. They couldn't find Washington. A loyalist almost destroyed the secrecy of the operation. But against all odds, they brought the army across, and they did it. In one case, there's one recording of they went across the river 11 times. 5 round trips to bring the army across. And it's at dawn that there's chaos at the embarkation point. Washington himself restores order by lifting a massive boulder atop his head, saying, "I'll sink the ship to hell if there's not order," which he reestablishes. And then the miracle occurs where a fog rolls in and screens the movement of the rest of Glover's men as they transport the army across. And they do it again and again. At Pelham Bay, for instance, Pell's Point, Throng's Neck, it's the Marblehead men that make some epic stands. It's Glover's Red Brigade in particular, where they have a collapsible defense that allows the army to escape. And then, of course, at one of the most important inflection points in American history, in world history, it's at Trenton that all of the other crossings of Washington's army completely fail. It's only the Marbleheaders that get that portion of the army across. And they cross over 12 miles above Trenton, and they march down. And the forgotten thing that most people don't realize is it's Glover's men that seize the Assunpink Creek Bridge. And instead of a victory for Washington's forces, it's a double envelopment and a crushing victory where Johann Rahl's regiment is nearly destroyed or captured. And they play a role in the 10 crucial days in the Battle of Assunpink Creek and in the Battle of Princeton. But half the regiment, more than half, actually goes home to Marblehead, where their families are dying and many people are bankrupt. But a large portion of the regiment stays on and continues to fight and help change the course of the war. And that is the subject of the Indispensables. It's about our origin story. It's about a regiment that is diverse, which is unique. And some argue maybe one of the more diverse regiments of the Continental Army. And they worked as a team, and they were extremely effective, arguably one of the greatest regiments to ever fight under American arms. But that's just a small taste of what the Indispensables is about. And I'll be happy to take questions.
Excellent. Norm, over to you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Patrick. Our next speaker is Donald Grady Shomette, who is the author of Privateers of the Revolution, War on the New Jersey Coast, 1775 to 1783. He also wrote other works on the shipping and navies of the colonial and revolutionary era of the early American Republic. I introduce to you Donald Shomette.
Okay.
Here I am. Am I on?
I'll get you there in a second.
Am I on?
Yep, you're on.
Okay. Well, it's a pleasure being here. I became involved in my studies on privateers 47 years ago when I was doing an archaeological survey of a privateering base on the New Jersey coast. Most Americans consider privateers as pirates. That's something I'll discuss a little bit later, but most people don't link privateering with any place other than New England, and that's partially a discrimination created by the New England Brahmins in the educational process in the 19th century. But in matter of fact, the privateering operations of the continental states of the United States were actually very, very prominent and important to the outcome of the revolution. In my book on Privateers of the Revolution, I'm dealing not with New England, but I'm dealing with the New Jersey coast. The north end of the New Jersey coast, of course, is the entrance to New York Bay. The south end, of course, is the entrance to the Delaware River, and that 130 miles or whatever the distance is there was largely unoccupied and quite strategically relevant because of the inlets, because of the barrier islands and the wastelands behind them. The New Jersey pine barrens were very poorly occupied by humans. There were smugglers, some bog iron mining and some timber cutting, but basically unoccupied areas and quite wonderful places for small craft to go hide. At the outset of the revolution, on August 23rd, when George III declared the colonies to be in a state of rebellion, we didn't really have much to go for on the sea. We had a nursery of seamen, of course. We were just talking about the wonderful story of the Marblehead men. Our nursery here had a wonderful capacity for waging war with the manpower. An awful lot of these people were relevant during the French and Indian Wars of 15 years before. But when we entered the war, we entered a war against the mightiest sea power on the planet. Beginning of the war, the Royal Navy had 270 major ships. I think 60 of them, no, 130 of them. I forget what the number is, but they had an enormous number of guns, the ships that were 60 guns or larger. And by the middle of the war, they had 40 or 50 of these on the American station. By the middle of the war, of course, it's a world war. France is in, Spain is in, the Netherlands are in. And it becomes a war of empire. But our military defenses were largely dependent upon supplies from Europe, from France, from Spain, and to some extent the Netherlands. And we ended up with a three-stool approach to maritime activity. Number one, we created the Continental Navy, of course, which was not that good. Number two, 11 of the 13 states had their own navy. And number three, in April of 1775, we created, in October 1775, Congress passed an act, the Privateering Resolves, which allowed for Congress to issue letters of marque and reprisal or letters of privateering. And there's a difference. Now, this wasn't the first. Of course, Massachusetts was right off the mark at the very beginning of the war, as was Rhode Island and to some extent Connecticut. And therein lies why we always focus on the history of privateering as being New England centric. The Continental Commissions were issued by Congress and given to the states. The state governments, committees of safety or whatever the administration was authorized to issue those in the state under the state's name. So Congress issues the privateer commissions to states. The states issue them under the state name. Now we have a not known list. I've comprised a list which is in the National Archives, part of which was published in 1906. But we end up with 1,742 Continental Commissions that we know of, probably more. And that's a lot of commissions, and you would think that's a lot of ships. If you count up the number of guns, you got 15,818 guns. You got 58,588 men to man the ship. And you're talking about a huge amount, but actually that's not the way it was. Privateers were sailing on a commission per cruise, and there's a difference between cruise and voyage. The letter of marque is basically a commission for sailing on a commercial voyage, but the ability to take ships while you're en route. Privateering was purpose-built or used to go out and simply attack the enemy commerce. We couldn't hope by any imagination to defeat the Royal Navy in any agreeable fashion. John Paul Jones, of course, does a good shot at it. Joshua Barney does, and Silas Talbot do a try. But overall, we could not hope to defeat the Royal Navy, but we could impact their commerce, make it so bloody and hard for them to respond to the commerce attack that it became very difficult to wage the war. My book is largely on the New Jersey and Pennsylvania privateers, and Pennsylvania ended up with 538 commissions, which is 20.88% of all of the privateer commissions issued. And that was for 4,550 guns and 18,126 men. Well, that sounds like a lot, but many of these ships were on multiple voyages. And we can look at the owners of the ships, which I've broken down. We can look at the people who put up the money for the ships and what the ships are supposed to do. We have ships of all kinds from the very beginning. We're using the small little Bermuda sloop. We're using rowboats in essence, and sometimes a little more than that. But by the end of the war, we have purpose-built ships that are carrying 24, 28 guns with crews of 200 men, which sail on a 6-month voyage. This is the evolution of the war. And what does this mean for us, though, as a nation trying to get out of this, to get our independence? Privateersmen were actually pretty much the sailors, the mariners, the Gloucester fishermen, the Pennsylvania merchantmen, some cases even the southern states, that Maryland and Virginia. At one point, Virginia is actually putting out a navy that's second only in size to the Pennsylvania State Navy. which is second in size to the Continental Navy. All of these states are putting out privateers under commission. And people who sign on are doing this for two reasons. One is the money. Two is the patriotism. And three is the adventure, of course. But this turns out not to be so good for us towards the end of the war. The consequence of this is that the British insurance rates, of course, went astronomical. The very first two privateers to sail under Continental Commissions came out of Philadelphia, the Chance and the Congress. And these were little sloops that weren't very big. They sailed down in April of 1776 through the Capes. They were supposed to escort a convoy of merchantmen out while they went out there, but the Capes are being blockaded by the British, as they normally were, at one time or another. And in one 3-week voyage down to the West Indies, they brought in literally the value of almost $1 million. And that was to be divided by the owners of the ships, which got the big part of it, the captains and officers, and of course the seamen. And in one voyage, it was said a seaman could make his entire life's income in one voyage, and that wasn't far from the truth in some cases. One of the merchants who entered into privateering in Philadelphia, a fellow named Blair McClanahan, who had been a private in Washington's army for a very short time until he decided to do something else. By the end of the war, he had owned or majority interest in over 50 privateers out of Philadelphia. Most of these privateers found the the New Jersey coast great places to bring in their cargoes, because the Cape, the Chesapeake Capes, the Delaware Cape, and of course New England was often under blockade. So these little lost places are where they started to bring stuff in. And these sites became sites where major privateering bases were established, forward bases. Chestnut Neck, Tom's River, Great Egg Harbor, and others. So privateering actually ended up having a major impact on the war. Most of the privateersmen, however, did not. 11,000 privateersmen were lost on at least one prison ship, the Jersey prison ship in the East River. So, and we can document 8,000 of those men who were buried in the shoreline. This is one of the major impacts on the American Revolution, because the commerce, the soldiers who were captured, the British supplies, which helped keep our revolution going, that were captured by privateers, helped change the course of the war.
So that's great. So I think we've only got a few minutes left, and Patrick needs to leave us by at 8 o'clock sharp. So why don't we, Norm, switch to some questions for Patrick, and then if people want to stay on, we can finish up with a few more questions.
Patrick, you mentioned that the Marblehead Regiment was one of the most diverse. What do you mean by that?
Based on the muster rolls and pension files and everything else, the regiment itself was diverse in terms of racially diverse, in terms of the individuals that made up the regiment. There were free African Americans, there were a couple Hispanics, there were Native Americans, and it was diverse in terms of socioeconomic status. It was rich and poor. The elite of Marblehead were in the regiment, as well as the poorest members of the regiment. They all served side by side, and they made a really an incredible team, as evidenced by their exploits, during the American Revolutionary War.
Don, you mentioned that you're talking about the privateers, and I'm of the opinion that a lot of people think that privateers had very little impact on the whole scheme of the war. I'm of the opinion that any damage inflicted or any harm inflicted on the enemy is a positive effect, has a positive effect, and over the time it accumulates and contributes to the war, and that there are so many more privateer actions than there are formal naval actions. What do you think?
I agree with you 100%. And if you look at the economic damage, if you do a breakdown of the known captures, the known prizes, the known commodities, which has never been done entirely. But if you look at that, and then you look at the rates of insurance and the companies in under British ownership that are going under, particularly in the West Indies, the sugar trade almost went bankrupt. An enormous number of companies went bankrupt because of the war. And that was one of the elements that played against the British government. The other element, of course, was that the British also started field privateers out of New York City. And eventually, by the end of the war, most of our seamen had been captured. And an awful lot of them died on the prison ships. And the consequence of that was that had the war proceeded another 3 or 4 years, we would not have been able to wage anything at sea without being a French or Spanish support. So, but the economic damage was awesome. And the ships captured, there were 5 ships captured for every one that the British captured. And that was from Lloyd's of London.
I would just point out, you make a great point, Don. The economic damage was enormous, and many of the prizes came at exactly the right time in the war. At a crucial inflection point, right, where those supplies were desperately needed. The other thing was, I think, that is often overlooked is the indirect impact of where escorting had to be taken place, which was an opportunity cost to the Royal Navy. They had to supply warships to transport these transport ships, or to escort them. Then they couldn't be used in other duties. So there's a massive opportunity cost with all the activities that was going on, this asymmetric warfare basically at sea that we were conducting.
Another side effect is that insurance rates increased from 7% to 28% in 1 year.
It's enormously important right there. That huge, the economic impact and damage, as Don pointed out, is just enormous.
So if you want to look at the strategic damage, the same thing. I mean, Port of New York, with all the Royal Navy, all the transports in there, a number of times was simply closed down because of the proximity of the privateer operations right off of New York Bay. Well, that was strategic.
We're running out of time. I think Roger wants to conclude the session.
Thanks, Norm. We could go all night. And I really want to thank Norm for being our guest host. And I appreciate David Price and his talk on Washington Crossing. I want to thank my authors, Patrick O'Donnell and Don Shomette. If you have, the question and answer period had to run short. If you have questions for either of the authors, you can email me, roger@rogerwilliamsagency.com, and I will forward them to the authors. So there's so much to talk about. Don Shomette's book on privateers is fantastic. Patrick O'Donnell's book is terrific. I hope you will join us on June 22nd when David Price will be here to talk about his book, The Road to Assunpink Creek. Patrick mentioned Assunpink Creek. And David wrote a terrific book on that engagement. He's going to be joined by Jerry Hurwitz, who wrote a book on called The Alamo of the Revolution. Fort Griswold up in Connecticut. And with that, I'm going to thank my audience and all my SAR compatriots from all over the country who have joined us tonight, and all of my regulars. I appreciate your joining us tonight, and we'll see you on June 22nd. Good night, everybody. Thank you, everybody.
Good
Thanks.
night, everyone.
Night.
Roger.
Thank you.